Aloha. My name is Roger Jelinek. I'm Executive Director of the Hawaii Book and Music Festival, and it's my pleasure to welcome attendees and to bring to you this really unusual event with a highly original premise, and I think you're going to thoroughly enjoy it. You're in the very capable hands of Dr. George Tanabe and the author Vanessa Sasson all the way from Montreal. So without further ado, I'm going to turn this over to George Tanabe. Mahalo.
Okay, thank you, Roger. I add my aloha to everyone who has joined in this event, which is a conversation with Vanessa Sasson, who has written a novel about the Buddha's wife, whose name was Yasodhara, and the name of the novel is Yasodhara and the Buddha. So we're going to talk about the novel, and we will have about 10 or 15 minutes at the end of our session, which is an hour. And you're welcome to send in your questions on chat, and we'll get to your questions at the last portion of the event. This program is being recorded, and you'll be able to access it later on the Better Tomorrow Speakers program, the YouTube channel. That's a University of Hawaii program. So we will jump right into the book and Vanessa. And so let me just start by saying that, the Buddha's wife hasn't gotten as much press as the Buddha has. And so many people may not be too familiar with who Yasodhara was. And so let's start there. So Vanessa, if you could give us an introduction to the Buddha's wife, that'll get us going.
That would be my pleasure. Thank you so much. Thank you, Roger, for the invitation. And George, it's so much fun to be with you on Zoom again. So it's really nice. So Yasodhara, most people I've encountered over the years since I started this project, I always get the same response. People look at me and they go, "Oh my God, I didn't know the Buddha had a wife." This is like the regular, and I've had this also from practicing Buddhist community members. I've encountered this response in South Asia, in all kinds of places. Obviously, serious practitioners, scholars, lots of people also know that the Buddha had a wife, but for a lot of people, she's a very evasive character. And for the most part, when they know about her, they just kind of, oh yeah, he was married and he left her. And she's kind of a footnote in the Buddha's life story for the most part. But I got really quite fascinated with her the more I learned about her and the more I found her in texts all over the place. That she's actually a really prominent character in the early sources, and she's she's feisty, she's strong, she's important. And even more than that, what I started to discover was that if you look at the past life stories of the Buddha, so in Buddhism, you have this notion of reincarnation and of people living lifetime after lifetime after lifetime. And the Buddha's past life fables, they're kind of like fables. They're called jatakas. They're these stories of who the Buddha was in his past life. And sometimes he's a crocodile, or he's a monkey, or he's a prince, or he becomes all kinds of things. And in so many of those life stories, she's there. And when she's there as his wife. So if he's a monkey, she's Mrs. Monkey, right? Like she's if he's an elephant, she's Mrs. Elephant. And it goes on over and over and over again for so many lifetimes. Whenever he appears and he's married to her. And so she's a character that's a multi-life relationship for him, so that they have been together for lifetimes. So when he leaves her in his final life, he leaves her after being with her almost forever. And that was what really struck a chord for me, and also made me feel very emotional about her. I thought, my goodness, he was with her for all that time and then he just leaves. And according to the tradition, he doesn't just leave her randomly. He leaves her the day she gives birth to their son. So it's a really dramatic story. It's a kind of epic tragedy in a lot of ways, the Buddha's life story for her. Obviously for him, he does quite well, but for her, it's a devastating narrative for a period of time. And so many Buddhist authors for 2000 years, if not longer, have been telling her life story. So what I don't quite get is why we haven't been telling her life story, right? How have we kept missing her? So if I tell you a little bit of the story so that audience members who don't know Buddhism that well can follow this, we have these stories of the two of them going lifetime after lifetime. In their final lifetime, there's even a legend that says that they were reborn at the same moment in the same kingdom, right? So that this continues as this kind of partnership. He's reborn as a prince in this fabulous kingdom, and the father is given a prophecy at his birth. He calls the astrologers and he gets this prophecy, and the prophecy is that one of two possibilities is the prince's future. Either he will become a great king and become the king that they hadn't seen in 10,000 years, and he'll make peace with his neighbors and everyone will be happy in the kingdom if he becomes king. The alternative is that he becomes a religious mendicant, that he becomes a religious teacher, he abandons the throne, he walks into the forest and he won't come back. And the king is devastated by this news because he needs his son to become a king. And so the idea that there's a risk that his son might actually become a religious teacher is terrible. So he panics and he makes a decision that colors the entire Buddha life story. He makes a decision, he realizes that there is a connection between suffering and contemplation, that when if we don't suffer, we can go on with our lives uninterrupted forever. We can enjoy ourselves, we can part, like there's nothing really stopping us if we're not suffering. But when we experience suffering, suddenly the material world doesn't satisfy us. And so suddenly going to the party is not going to be enough, or whatever it is that is our pleasure. It stops when you suffer. And suddenly you begin to wonder, well, what else is my life about? Right? And so there's a connection between the experience of suffering and the beginnings of contemplation, of existential questioning, of philosophy, of spirituality, of wondering, what am I doing here and what does this life mean? Because it's actually not as much fun as I thought it was going to be. So the king has this insight and he makes a decision that his son should never suffer. So that if his son never suffers, he'll never want to become a religious teacher. And so he closes in his son in the palace and kind of puts him in a gilded cage, according to all these early texts, and raises his son in this kind of radical extreme spoiling where everything he wants, he gets. And he is never to witness old age, illness, or death. And so the prince grows up really, really protected. But even with that, he's a future Buddha. And so you feel that his contemplative side is coming out. And so at one point, the ministers of the king say, we're not totally convinced he's going to stay, even though we've done all of this. And the guy has never seen anything. He's never gone to war. He's never seen poverty. So a wife might help that out. He had a harem, and there's definitely a big part of Buddhist imagination. But the thought was, well, if we get him married, maybe that will anchor him and he'll feel responsibility to the throne. It's like the beginnings of him becoming a king. And so they decide to get him married, and they go to tell the prince, according to one version. And he says, well, if you're going to have me marry someone, she's going to have to be spectacular. She's going to have to fulfill all these criteria, perhaps thinking that maybe they won't find her. She's got to be this tall and this beautiful and this smart and this everything else. And so the ministers go out, and it sounds very much like a fairy tale, and they go from house to house, knocking on every door. Can we find this perfect woman at this house? And eventually, this is actually not the version I told in the story. There's so many versions of how this played out. I'm just giving one. They knock on one door and they say, we're looking for a woman who fits all this criteria. And they read out the list. And Yasodhara is the one at the door. And she says, oh, well, that's me. And she says, but it's me and I'm the bride, but you better marry me off quick, because otherwise I'm going to marry someone else. Like, she's not interested in waiting around. And so it's you get this sense of audacity with her as a character. And so they go and they report back, and they eventually decide that she will be the princess. But And this is where you see this fabulous storytelling that we have not been paying attention to for such a long time. They say, well, we just want to see how he reacts to her. This is one version of the story. So they say, we're going to have an event where all the maidens of the land are going to come to the palace, and he's going to give a gift to each one. And we want to see if he recognizes her, if he's attracted to her the way it should be. And so all the women appear, and he gives a gift to each woman, and he's not interested in any of them. And the last woman in the line is Yasodhara. She's obviously late. And she goes up to the podium. She presents herself to the prince, and there's nothing left in the treasure. Like the chest is empty. There's no more gifts to give. So she looks in the box, and he looks in the box, and she says to him, is there really nothing left? And he says, well, hold on. And he, in some versions, he pulls off a necklace from his own neck, and he gives it to her. And in one account, she says to him, is that it? Which is just such a crazy character to have in a Buddha life story. So that's how they choose each other. And that's when you know, oh, this is a good match. There's other versions of the story, and there's other scenes that I put in the book. And they get married, and they live together for years, but hidden in the palace. And then one day, the future Buddha, the prince, escapes the palace, and he sees suffering. He sees old age and sickness and death, and he's utterly overwhelmed by it. And so he comes home, and according to many accounts, he comes home the day she's giving birth. And so he's out there in the world witnessing suffering for the first time, and she's in the world, in her palace, literally ripping her body apart, like in suffering. And so you see again the parallel of these two characters who are so strong, but he's experiencing it one way and she's experiencing it another. And so according to one Pali text, he goes back, and there's a Sanskrit text that says that he goes to see his father, and he says to his father, I'm going to go now. And his father panics and says, you can't go. This is what he feared all his life. And he says, well, I can't stay. And he says, well, is there anything I can do to make you stay? And he says, well, if you can promise me that I'll never suffer, then I'll stay. And he says, I promise. And he says, you can't make that kind of a promise. And he says, don't ask me to stay. I see that the house is on fire. You can't ask me to stay. So that's one way that the story goes. The other way is that he goes to see her, and she's sleeping in bed with her newborn son. And he stands on the threshold, and he's looking at her sleeping, and he looks at his son, who he hasn't met yet. And according to this particular text, he thinks to himself that he wants to touch his son. And so you have that sense of his longing, like the complexity of his experience. But he knows that if he touches his son, she will wake up, and then he won't be able to go. And that line in that text was really the line that made me write this book, was that awareness of this kind of complexity of his experience and of a connection as a family that is so almost never identified. Particularly in Western Buddhism, we don't make that connection at all. But here you have this man who has a family and is drawn to his family, but also knows that if he gets too close, he's never going to be able to do what he has to do. And so he decides not to touch his son, and he knows he will see him when he's done with his journey. And so he leaves. And the next morning, she wakes up to find out that her husband is gone, and she's devastated. And the literature tells us that she's devastated. They don't gloss over it. They don't pretend it's not true. They give us her pain. And so to me, she's a character, and she has a story that we really need to love and engage with and hear. And I don't know why we haven't been hearing it all this time.
Yeah, we could speculate about all of that, but I mean, you're a professor of religious studies at Marianopolis College in Montreal. You've been studying the primary sources, and you mentioned already that there are these different versions of the story. So in putting together a kind of a coherent story on your part, you needed to somehow sift through those different versions and make some choices, creative choices. So I like to get into that whole issue of what the sources tell us and what they don't tell us. But before I do that, though, I want to just follow up on the whole story of the way how the Buddha's father tried to spare him any kind of suffering so that he'd stay at home. And it doesn't work because he goes out and he sees suffering. And once he sees that, he becomes committed to finding a path or finding a solution to the problem of suffering. And the only way he can do that is to leave home. But there's a dramatic irony in the leaving of home in order to find a solution to suffering. And that is that in and of itself becomes the cause of Yasodhara's suffering and the rest of the family too, but particularly Yasodhara. Is there any indication that the Buddha grappled with this irony?
Oh my God, that's such a good question, George. I don't know.
Or is he so unfeeling, like, no, I'm not going to touch my son, because it might make me human.
Oh, it's a really hard question. I wrote the story that he did grapple, but it wasn't his story, it was hers. So he's kind of at arm's length because it's tricky to write about the Buddha. Like, I don't know quite how to do that. I think that scene, the reason it drew me so much of him kind of wanting to touch his son and not doing it was for me a tiny window of possibility that he grappled, that the text was admitting to. But Buddhist texts, by and large, are interested in portraying a really kind of fantastical Buddha. And he can be complicated before. Afterwards, he can't be. Afterwards, he really has to be awakened and free from all of this. And so there's an agenda to Buddhist writing usually that makes it difficult. You have to kind of grasp at straws and find little bits of information here and there that might suggest that the authors could see him suffering. But it's difficult to find that real evidence. But I can't imagine, if the Buddha was a human being, that any of this was done easily. And the fact that he goes, so one of the things I put in the book is I have her challenge him on this, because she knows, she can see it's coming, right? They're in a relationship. And so they talk about it in the book. And she eventually says to him, well, why don't you take me with you? And the reason she says that is that we have evidence all over Indian storytelling of hermits and sages and religious teachers going off into the forest with their families, not without them. So she was perfectly in her right to ask that. And the fact that he doesn't, he's drawing a hard line. He's not taking her, but there's a problem there. Like, why won't he take her with him? And to me, the only answer is because he's too attached and he won't achieve what he needs to achieve if she's there. But that's the only logic I can make of it. And then in some of the Buddhist texts, he goes to the forest where he meets hermits with their wives. So the literature is really conscious that this was an option and that she was not allowed to go. Right. But when he becomes awakened, then his whole family shows up. So they come back in his life. They don't stay far away. So there's got to be a connection. I can't imagine him so cold and unconnected. It doesn't make sense to me. But that might be my contemporary reading. I don't know. What do you think, George?
Well, first of all, reading the book, it not only made Yasodhara come alive because, again, using the techniques of fiction, you can put feelings and words in her mouth that the primary texts don't have, and thereby you, as the novelist, can make her really come alive again. You give her life. The text to some degree can do that, but a novelist using contemporary language can really infuse so much more life. And I think that's what you did. You made her come alive. The thing that the other thing that the book did for me was not only did she become alive as a human being, but it made me realize something that I always knew, but it wasn't really it didn't have the impact on me that your book gave me, and that is that the story of the Buddha is a story of a family. That this is a family story, and by focusing on Yasodhara and the father, the mother, the aunts, and it's a whole family story. Devadatta, Ananda. I mean, everybody's related in this story
Everybody's
pretty much.
related.
It's one big family.
It is.
And the whole point of the renunciation and detachment is that the Buddha walks out. He walks out on his family. He leaves his family behind. But then at the end of the story, after he becomes the Buddha, and now he is forming a Sangha, a group of people who are going to become his followers, his family joins him. And so, in a way, it's a kind of, he's a lucky guy. I mean, he gets to have both worlds, he leaves his family in order to go on his spiritual journey, but then his family comes with him and then joins him. So now he has both. He has his family and he has his realizations that are the result of having left his family. I mean, it's such an intriguing set of very complicated relationships with his family and with his insights. So in the end, he was a lucky guy.
I love that interpretation. I think that's brilliant. I think we're just so fixated, for obvious reasons, on the renunciation aspect of Buddhism, right? That the Buddha left and that he lives as a monk and he's alone. Like, we have this very kind of elaborate imagination of this isolation of the Buddha, because he always sits on every shrine alone. I kept thinking every temple should have like an image of her on the shore. Like, he did this because also he had a family and they supported him, and then they let him go, and then they joined him again. Like, he was so deeply interconnected with his tribe, with his community, with his family, and they always come back. So the picture that we have of the Buddha sitting all by himself, I think, has given us a false impression of how the story is told. And the storytellers really insert all these characters over and over again. So they could have separated them all out, but they chose to keep all these characters and to have them come back life after life. She's not the only one that's always there, right? His mother and his father and his child, they're all traveling through cosmic time together from one lifetime to another. So he is surrounded by his family forever. And to separate him out gives a false impression of what I think the storytellers were doing. You know? And it's a funny thing that we've gotten so fixated on him as an isolated individual. The tradition doesn't adopt an isolated image. It's a family story. It's a tribal.
It's so interesting because it raises the question as to just how detached was he, because again he's lucky, he has everybody come back to him, and so he is able to be surrounded by his family again in the end. And it's a really happy ending to this story where he gets to have his cake and eat it too. Maybe it's one of the few examples of being able to have your cake and eat it too. So he's a lucky guy.
There's a line that always struck me. It's in an Indian text called the Apadana, and it's these poems of the monks and nuns near the ends of their lives. And when his stepmother dies, Mahapajapati, she's just about to die. She's awakened. She has followed him into the forest, and she also gets realization. And now it's her moment to die. And when she dies, he's there. And he describes her, he says she is dying, and he describes her as his mother. And then he ensures that the cremation is done properly. Like, he's present at all the stages of her ritual. And that always struck me as, he doesn't say this nun is now dead. He says my mother, right? Like, he hasn't, that cut that we imagine, it hasn't happened. He might not be as attached to her as he was before realization. So the nature of the relationship, the way you experience it changes, but the relationship is still there. It's not denied.
Yeah.
And I think we often have this imagination that you become a monk or a nun, or you become a Buddha, and you don't see the relationships.
Yeah.
Anymore. They don't exist. It's like you're non-human. You're like an alien that feels nothing. And the literature doesn't paint that picture.
Yeah.
It's much more human and relational.
Yeah. Yeah, it just reminds me of, and I just thought of it now, the the classic canonical paintings about in East Asia, Chinese and Japanese paintings about the death of the Buddha. And so you have him lying down surrounded by salt trees, and all the disciples and all of the animals are weeping and crying, except for Ananda. But up in the upper right hand corner of the scroll is a floating cloud coming down and a group of people, and it's the Buddha's mother.
Yes.
So she is coming back,
Yes.
and so once again, it emphasizes this, that the whole story is a kind of a family story. It's a family relationship. And as you say, it so goes against this whole image that we have with the Buddha of having, completely denounced and left his family. I mean, the term in Chinese and Japanese Buddhism for becoming a monk is shukke, means leave home. You leave home. That's what it means to be a monk. But the Buddha always had his home with him in some way.
Yeah.
Lucky,
I think that's right.
Let me get back to this whole issue of the the many different versions. And as a scholar of this literature, you've covered them all, and so you're aware that there are so many different versions, and each version is not just a repetition of the other. To add something. So there's a kind of a creative process going on as each writer retells the story, but embellishes it or changes it, and comes up with a slightly different version of the story. And with so many different versions, it raises a question of, well, is there a correct version? Is there a right version? Is there a version that we can count on and say, yes, this is the factual account of the Buddha's wife, or the Buddha himself, or of any of the other characters for that matter. But you very provocatively say in your book that this is not historical fiction. And we think of I think of historical fiction as being a story about a real historical character. And then around that, you build a fictional story, but at the core of it, there's a real historical character. So that's historical fiction. So what I want to ask you is, why do you not consider your book to be historical fiction? Because it suggests that you are not confident that there's a real factual historical character at the center of the story, around which you're throwing it all kinds of, Vanessa, creative imaginary additions to the story. So is that the case? Do you not have the confidence that she was real?
So I just want to say to whoever's watching this that George and I are both smiling at each other, because I know what he's doing and he knows what he's doing by asking me this question. Yeah. Okay. So we don't have any solid material evidence for any of this stuff, any of these stories to have happened. You can say that it is likely that the Buddha existed probably about 2,500 years ago in northern India. That's a reasonable thing to assume, but we can't say it for certain. What we also cannot say is, even if he did exist, what he was like, what he experienced, we can't say anything. All the texts that we do have date to about 2,000 years ago, which means that if he existed 2,500 years ago, we've got a 500-year gap before we start getting writings. Which of those writings is telling the story correct? And they all tell different stories. There's like 50 versions of everything. Buddhist writing is so prolific and so expansive and so playful. And every generation, there's almost a sense of open-ended invitation that everyone is welcome to write another version of the story, because there's so many stories out there. So you almost get this impression that Buddhism just says, tell it again, and you can tell it again. And everywhere Buddhism goes, it gets told again in a new form, so that it goes to China and it becomes a very Chinese story, with filial piety as being like a really foundational element that we don't see in the early South Asian materials, right? And then it goes to Japan, it goes to Korea, it comes to North America. Everywhere it goes, the story gets told again. So which story is the true story? How and who can evaluate something like that? So I'm not creating historical fiction. If any of this is historically accurate, well, the gods will be able to know that, but I can't know that. And it doesn't really matter to me either, because it's a world of stories, and the stories are alive and they keep getting told. And to me, that is a life in and of itself. I don't need to know, I don't need to be able to track it and figure out, okay, here it's true. It's all true and none of it's true. And it doesn't matter. You know, the stories play so many other roles than just, did it historically happen? So I think sometimes that there's like a extraordinary materialism that has snuck into all these religious traditions because we keep looking for material truth. And I think that cheapens religions sometimes, right? Good stories don't need to be true. They just need to be a good story.
Yeah, that might be a little disconcerting to some people. I would think,
I know.
you know, but I understand what you mean. And you describe your novel as being hagiographical fiction as opposed to historical fiction. So what is hagiography? Could you explain the difference between, you know, history and hagiography?
So hagiography is this practice that you get in religious traditions of telling a sacred life story. So all these early texts that I keep referencing, these are hagiographies. These are texts that tell a sacred story about the Buddha. And we have so many of them. And they're much later from any kind of historical truth we'll ever find. So what I've done is not recreate history. I've built on the foundations of the hagiographies that I had access to. And I created something new. So that's why I called it a hagiographical fiction. I thought that was more true because I don't have access to history, but I do have access to the hagiographies. And so that's where I'm comfortable. Does that make sense?
That makes sense. So you actually, I don't know if you think of yourself this way, but I think of you in this way, that you stand in the line of a tradition of writers who have retold the story of Yasodhara and added your own, you know, imaginative speculations or additions, you know, to the story. So if we think of your novel as being, you know, hagiographical fiction, it's not really a departure from the tradition. In fact, it's a continuation of the tradition. So you stand in that very venerable ancient tradition of, you know, telling stories about the wife of the Buddha, without worrying too much about, you know, whether they were factual or not. But there is a concern, I would think, and this is what I want to ask you, is that while you're not too worried about facts, are you concerned about truth? That is, to tell something true about Yasodhara or about what it meant to be the Buddha's wife, even if there is no foundation for that truth in fact. I don't know if I'm making sense, but
well, they're tricky words. Right? Like fact and truth and history.
Yeah.
These are all really tricky things. And I don't know what's true. The only thing I can do that I found myself able or willing to play with is to try to imagine, based on all the stories that I've received, that I've had the privilege of being able to read, what do I see in the story now? That was the question that I had. And so it wasn't so much, am I telling the truth? Because I don't know. But what I think there'd be something presumptuous about assuming I've told something true. But what I've told feels true to me. That I wrote this with I wrote this with my heart. And so for me, it was the only way I can conceive of this story. And the only way, I mean, to be honest, it was also my personal vehicle to forgiving the Buddha, because I was quite mad at him for this story. right? And so there was an element there of me having to just process, how do I make sense of a Buddha who leaves his wife the day she gives birth and doesn't even say goodbye? Like that has been haunting me for decades. So this was, I wanted to grapple with a story that was hard for me, that I loved, but that I was upset with. And so I've read everything that I could possibly read to understand, how did other storytellers grapple with it, to then give myself space to figure out, how would I tell the story so that I can make sense of it, and I can be at peace with the Buddha for doing what he did, because it was upsetting me. So this was a very personal, even though I know it's very public because it's published, it's a very personal experience to, when you write a book, that you really mean it. You know, I mean, you could write a guidebook and that's probably not that personal, but when you write a book like this, it's your own personal question. And this is my personal answer of, this is how the story can be true to me. I guess that's my answer, but I don't know if I touched truth, or if any of it is true. I can't answer a question like that. I have no idea.
No. And actually, I don't mean truth with a capital T, you know, like
that's
the
right.
truth, you know, so no. But just a truth in the way, in the sense of being true to what she might have been, true to what she must have been, namely a woman who loved her husband, who then walked out on her and caused her a tremendous amount of sufferings which you capture so poignantly in the novel, you know. And so it's true to her suffering. And to me, her truth is, you know, a woman who suffered tremendously the consequences of what her husband did, for whatever great a reason he did, for the truth with the capital T. Her truth with the small t is that it was a tough life that she faced, and the consequences of what he did were not easy for her. And so for me, you captured the truth, small t, of Yasodhara, you know, of her life. And I think you managed to do that. You succeeded to do that precisely because you could add to the legendary material, the hagiographical material, and not worry about, now let's see, did she really cry on that night or not? You know, no, she cried.
That's right.
Do we know that for sure? No, we don't know. But, you know, she cried. And that's her truth as to, you know, how she felt about all of this. In my mind, you captured the truth of Yasodhara. You know, one of the questions that we dealt with when we were planning this program is the University of Hawaii Press has just published a new book by Bernard IV of Columbia, and it's called "The 1,001 Lives of the Buddha."
Oh, I just read that in French. It came out in English?
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Oh, I didn't. I thought it was only in French.
No, it's in English now.
Oh, nice.
Yeah.
Good book.
So it's published by the University of Hawaii Press.
Lovely. Okay.
And so we were going to, as we were talking about this, you know, planning this program, we're going to maybe include Bernard and you and both of your books, because both of you really touch upon this whole issue of what our primary sources really tell us and what they don't. So let me just read a very brief description of Bernard's book. Many biographies of the Buddha have been published in the last 150 years, and all claim to describe the authentic life of the historical Buddha. This book, written by one of the leading scholars of Buddhism and Japanese religion, starts with the opposite assumption and argues that we do not yet possess the archival and archaeological materials required to compose such a biography. All we have are narratives, not fact.
That's right.
And so, you know, you can see how his book and your book really approach the sources in in the same spirit of taking the stories seriously without worrying about whether there were facts or not. And so the description of the book is once the search goes on, once the search for the historical Buddha is abandoned, there is no longer any need to limit the narrative
Yes.
to early Indian stories. The life or lives of the Buddha as an expression of the creative imagination of Buddhas developed beyond India over the centuries. And so, again, this is an open invitation to maybe write something, a novel about the Buddha, in the same way that you have written a novel about Yasodhara, and add to that long tradition of telling stories about the Buddha without having the benefit of knowing whether it was fact or not. And as you point out, the literature for Buddhism is has that serious gap of 500 years between when the Buddha supposedly lived and the first sources that come out. I mean, the first gospel of Jesus is about 70 years after he died. 500 years is a long time. And, there's, it's hard to feel any great confidence that whatever we have about the Buddha is factually true or not. But both of your approaches, Bernard's approach and your approach, just sort of frees us from that.
I think so.
We don't have to worry too much about what was factual. We
Well,
do,
its own
and
kind
that
of
frees us to
materialism.
concentrate on the truth of the Buddha. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, that's the thing. It's its own kind of materialism, and it becomes a trap, right? That if everything has to be somehow provable in some kind of objectively material way, well, then we're not going to have anything left of ancient history. Almost nothing from ancient history can be proved. And it's a kind of an odd way to relate to a tradition that is asking you to expand your mind and to expand your imagination. So I do, and then when you look at how Buddhism is structured, it doesn't have one text, it has a million texts. So, I mean, my students always ask me, what's the Buddhist Bible? And there's no Bible, there's a million Bibles, right? Buddhism is just always writing and adding more literature to its repertoire. That to me seems like an invitation to say, go write your own. Go participate, imagine the tradition, imagine what this feels like, imagine what it is like to walk away from your home. Imagine what it is like also to see everyone cry and to know all the people you've disappointed because you took this really profound step. That is a paradox that the tradition maintains, and it's genius. It doesn't erase it. It doesn't say, oh, he becomes the Buddha and everybody celebrates. It's he goes off to become the Buddha and he hurts everyone. The king doesn't have his son anymore. The kingdom doesn't have anyone on the throne. His wife doesn't have her husband. The child doesn't have a father. I mean, he has hurt everyone. And the literature tells us they cry and they sob, and she's devastated. And she walks through gardens looking at all the places where they used to sit and wonder, why isn't he with her anymore? And his mother-in-law cries so hard in one text that her eyes are covered with scales from all the salt of her tears. The texts give you the pain. They tell you this was a tough decision for everyone. And yet it was the right decision. And that too is so great. Like, how many times have we been called to do something that is going to upset people in our lives, right? To truly do what you need to do in your life. This is the paradox of really living your life. And the tradition holds that paradox. It doesn't erase it. It doesn't say everybody wave goodbye and say, go have a good time. They're like, what are you doing? And I think that's a story that should be told and told again and told again. And I think we should tell it ourselves because we live it in our own ways. To me, this is the most wonderful thing about Buddhist storytelling.
Yeah. Now, there are a couple of, I'm looking at some of the chat questions and comments that we've received. And I like to refer to some of them that talk about, well, there is a danger. I'm sorry.
Did we want to ask if anybody wants to ask their questions live?
Oh, yeah. If anyone wants to ask their questions live, if you raise your hand, our technician will put your audio on. But at any rate, the comments have to do with this whole notion of well, if we can free ourselves from historical facts or from facts in general, and if we are free now to just sort of create our own alternative realities, or as Kellyanne Conway once said, alternative facts,
Yes.
like, why are you worried about facts, and we have this contemporary whole, conversation and issue going on about, what is true, and or is it just a conspiracy theory, or is it just
Oh, goodness.
some crazy idea out there that people are accepting as true, which is the essential what quality of the religious mind, of belief. I shouldn't say religion, of belief. I mean, we can believe anything we want to, we can believe there's no, unlike facts, beliefs are open-ended, and, we can believe anything we want to. So isn't there a kind of a danger in just sort of opening it up, and just say, well, it doesn't really matter whether this was true or not, whether it was factual or not, we can make up any story.
Yep. This is definitely a question of the moment. There's also a danger in closing everything down.
Yeah.
I don't know that we're going to avoid danger. I think this is also samsara, right? You open it up and people are going to manipulate it to say, well, then I could also imagine some conspiracy that everything, who knows? But if you shut everything down and you say you have to have it exactly like this, what happens to our creativity? What happens to the artistic spirit? We're going to say you're not allowed to have it unless it's materially viable. Like, this is a terrible direction to go as well. Extremes don't get us anywhere. And fear of the extreme is also a problem. So yes, it could go really badly, and we could all end up with Kellyanne Conway's remarks of, well, then if you can say this, then I can say that. On some level, you can't avoid that problem. Yeah. On another level, though, I think there is a nuance there, that there's an element of taking the time to study, to think, to explore, to question something, to give every question its time. When we go to these alternative facts and our fears of alternative, these are really quick responses. They're political responses. You're always going to have political monsters out there. They're going to try to control others, that are going to do bad things. But I do think there's a space for a creative mind to engage with a question and then be playful with it. And if we have no room for playfulness anymore because we're afraid that people are going to manipulate it, wow, that's terrible. So we have to keep the door open. And when we keep the door open, bad things happen. But when we close the door, other bad things happen.
Right.
So
well, I should tell our listeners, that our audience, that your book is not just a standalone novel. I mean, it's published by Bloomsbury Academic. I mean, it's kind of meant to be used in the classroom as well. So in some sense, in addition to being a novel, it's also kind of a textbook. And that transformation takes place with the fact that you have a lot of notes at the end of the book. You have suggestions for further reading, and you cite sources, primary and secondary sources. And your notes I found really fascinating, because here you're coming clean. You're kind of a liar, but you're telling us when you're lying.
Yes, I tell you,
you're making it up. But you tell us when you're making it up, and so in your notes, you say, well, the text say this, I had this idea.
That's correct.
And I thought, that's a great idea. No matter what the text say, I'll put in my idea. And so to me, it was a fascinating commentary on your creative process in writing the book. So I'd like to just get into some of the examples of and there are many, because throughout the book, you're constantly going back and forth between the primary text, your imagination. It's a conversation between you and the tradition. It's not just you making something up out of whole cloth. There is the character Nanda, and you point out in your notes of how not exactly really sure who he was, but you had assumed that he was younger than the Buddha, and you wrote the scene or scenes about, you treat him in the novel as if he were years younger, a younger man. But then you find out by going back to your sources that he was born only a few days after the Buddha. So essentially, they're the same age. But you don't correct that in your novel. You leave it. You let the age difference stand. And you had a reason for doing that. Could you explain why you let this quote error stand in the novel when you knew better?
Yeah, no, I had a lot of moments like that. And so there were moments where I thought, oh, no, that was a mistake. And let me fix that, make sure I'm in alignment with the tradition. And then there were other moments where I thought, oh, that's interesting that that's what I did here. And I decided to leave it. And so that was one case. And so one of my reasons for doing that is that Nanda is a very childish character in the tradition. So that's why I assumed he was so young, is that he's perpetually chasing women. He can't seem to get it together. Even like after he becomes a monk, he's still chasing women. Like he's a terrible monk. He's just perpetually obsessed with himself and obsessed with beauty, and he's always in trouble. And the Buddha's always trying to help him. So there's a real sense of his big brother attitude, which is why I had assumed in my imagination he was much younger. When I decided to keep him as much younger, I thought this is exactly how the tradition works, is that storytellers pick different pieces and then make a new story. And so when you'll come across a text and Nanda is almost the same age, and in another text, he'll be something else. And that happens all over the tradition. So I felt like I was doing something that the tradition does by keeping my own imagination and not always aligning with the story. It was in details, it wasn't in major events, but every once in a while I kept the mistake and I explained the mistake in my notes, because I think that's actually what a lot of the text did. Because when you read a lot of these early texts, they just change things all the time. So I don't think they were studying the text. I think they heard the stories and then they wrote it and with their own pieces added to it. And so I was doing the same thing. And I thought that was the right thing to do.
Okay, well, at least you came clean.
Oh yeah, it was very clean.
You were fabulous, but you're coming clean.
I admit
Paula
everything.
Arai has her hand up. And so Paula, would you like to ask your question?
Sure. Well, first, I mean, this is just fabulous. I'm over here watering at the mouth with the richness of the conversation. Back to that point about truth and, the danger of opening up our imaginations with no guardrails. I'm totally for, keeping freedom to imagine encouraged. And I wonder, though, when I work on this question, that I look at truth not in terms of facts, but, so-called religious truth. And in the Buddhist context, then wouldn't you try to discern if something is true or not by if it's effective at diminishing suffering or delusion or hatred or greed? And so those are, in my mind, guardrails for truth. Why it is you can't, conspiracy theories, that would be great if that would help you dissolve delusion. I don't care how it happens, just make it happen. But if conspiracy theories actually are used to promote and make a toxic environment of delusion, well, then we know, well, that's not true. So that's how I'm trying to sort it out. And I wondered if you have any other thoughts on that along that line.
First of all, Paula, it's so nice. I wish I could see your face.
I know.
I can't see your face. But I think that's a really smart way of, and I think I probably was doing that instinctively in terms of the decisions I was making, is what's a decision, where is the creativity allowed to go that's, I think is not going to cause harm and is going to help me understand the story, and where is it going to add to the right? So I think you've articulated a really interesting way of creating limitations. For me, I was thinking just more, where do you sit with the thoughtfulness of how does the story make sense to you? That's the way I just kept going. Like, how can I relate to it? And how can I also come to terms with the story? That was my language. but I think you've given us a different language of saying, okay, well, where are we causing harm? So I'll give you an example. There was an editor early on in the process, not from Bloomsbury, from some like much earlier in the process, who read my book and said, okay, this is great. I could see this becoming a bestseller, but you've got to do one thing to it for it to really hit the market. And I said, what? And he said, you need a sex scene. And yeah, so, and I was so stunned. I didn't know what to do. And I just said,
Vanessa,
well, no.
Vanessa, let me
No.
let me interrupt you. Your audio went out, and so I think we might have missed what your editor told you.
Really? You want me to say it again?
No, just what the editor said.
Yeah, you want me to say it again. So my editor, a previous editor, not from any of the editions that we have, wanted me to put a sex scene, and he thought then the book would sell better. And I was stunned, and I said no. And I said no, even though it would have been true. He was married to his wife. Of course, they would have had sex. Like this, there's no problem with that. And there's a couple of examples where Buddhism gets really prudish, but generally there's no sense of him being the virgin Buddha. So all of this could be true. And there's no part of me that wanted to do that because I felt like I would be causing harm to myself, if to no one else, that I did not want to imagine that. I did not want to contribute that. I didn't want to do that. And to me, it felt profoundly disrespectful and hurtful. And I could just imagine certain religious Buddhists reading this book and just being, no, I don't want to participate in that way. So that was the guardrail. Like it wasn't even like I just couldn't imagine doing something like that. And it was so devastating to imagine that this is what the market industry wanted from me. And that's where I'm just like, everything does not go. And some things are not right. And I guess you just know them when you see them.
Okay, well, thank you, Paula, for your question. And we're actually running out of time. We could go on and on and on, but I want to ask Vanessa to tell us about your sequel, because this is not the end of the series. This is not the end of the stories. You have a sequel that will be coming out next year, I believe it is. So tell us a bit about it.
Yeah, the next one is coming out with the publisher Equinox, and it's called The Gathering. It'll be coming out this June. And this one is the story of what happens. So near the end of the book, as George and I were talking, the family of the Buddha follows him into the forest and they become monks and nuns with him. The women become nuns, but the story of the women becoming nuns is much more difficult than the monks becoming nuns. The monks show up in the forest and the Buddha says, come, and that makes them a monk. And that's literally what happens. Just come and they are monks. When the women show up and they say, we would like to join you and learn realization by your side, the response is really quite painful. And so this was the other major story that I felt like I needed to write because I needed to figure out how I felt about the Buddha not being super welcoming to women and being quite complicated in his response. And his first response is, you shouldn't ask the question. And he says that 3 times. And then he leaves. And the women are left behind with nowhere to go. So they're actually quite spectacular. The women just pick up and follow. They don't take no for an answer, which is always had such a sense of awe for this story of he's not being generous towards them and they don't stop. And so they follow him and they ask again. And eventually he says yes. But it's a very difficult story. And he's now an awakened being. He's a Buddha. So for him to have this reticence about women in the community is a really difficult story for me to think through and to make sense of. Is how can an awakened being not be generous towards women when they want to practice like him? So that's been a challenging question, which means I had to write a book about it because that's how it goes. And so I rewrote that story with my imagination and with the text to try to figure out how I can make my peace with that story. So that's what's coming next.
So this will be coming out in next year?
Yeah, in June 2023. Yeah.
Okay. Well, so much to talk about. We'll
have to
talk
I feel like we're not done
as well. No, we're not done. I mean, as I said, you are continuing a very old tradition. And so you're keeping that tradition of storytelling and narrative alive. And I think it's doing what it has always done in the past, and that is to keep the true small t of all of these people alive, and really well rooted in our imaginations, because through your imagination you make it possible for us to really grasp these characters in ways that we would not otherwise have been able to do. So I want to thank you, Vanessa, for joining us all the way from Montreal. And we look forward to the next book, and maybe even another discussion of the next book if Roger Jelinek, the executive director of the Hawaii Book and Music Festival, allows us to do so. So thank you, Vanessa. Thank you, everyone, for joining us and for your questions. Roger?
Well, I hope we can do it in person. So thank you again for a fascinating discussion. I had one other question which would take another hour to resolve, but I'll just pose it anyway, which is, what's the relevance of the history or the fiction of this story to the essence of the teachings? Does it actually matter?
Yeah, no, it does matter, because so much of his biography is the source of the teachings. So his engagement with suffering is what has him leave, because he needs to resolve the question of suffering. So how he encounters suffering and how deeply it shakes him is what is going to lead him to finding the solution. So how you tell the story matters. And for so many Buddhists for so long, Buddhist community members have often modeled their lives on his story. So every part of his story and how you tell it becomes a lightning rod for other community members to then shape their story in the same way. So if the only story you have is he walked away and he didn't care about his wife and his child, and he was happy free in the forest with no repercussions, that's an invitation for that to keep happening. And we have evidence of that happening. But if you read the story differently, suddenly you have a question. Well, this was a complicated thing for him to do. And then they followed him and he was reunited. So I do think there's a tremendous amount of weight to how you tell the story for the tradition, because it shapes how others model their lives on him, and it shapes the teachings that come out of it. So I don't think it's incidental at all on that front.
That's admirably clarified. Thank you so much. I have one final request, which is we do absolutely intend and plan to be in person next year. It takes a lot of funding, and we have a fundraiser on January the 26th. And I hope we'll put that in your calendars. And I'll be reminding people endlessly between now and then to do so that we can enjoy sessions like this in person. Again, Vanessa, thank you so much. And George, as usual, wonderful moderator.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me. George, it was so fun to talk to you.
Thank you. It's great. Great. I'm looking forward to the day when we can actually meet in person. I mean, we've only seen each other on screen.
We need to do this in person.
But it's been a pleasure.
Thank you so much.